So this podcast serves as an introduction to erosion and deposition, what forces cause it, what you'll need to know about it, and it goes through some of the forces of erosion and deposition that we're going to learn about in less detail. First set of objectives is that you'll be able to define erosion and deposition, explain the causes of one type called mass movement, and also name and describe the types of mass movement: rock falls, rock slides and landslides, slumps, mud flows, and creep. So let's start with our definitions. What are erosion and deposition? Erosion is the process by which natural forces move sediments from one location to another. So it's the force of moving sediments. Deposition is the laying down of sediments once erosion is no longer able to carry them. Another way to think about this is erosion removes and moves the sediment, and deposition adds it. So these are the second and third pieces of a three-step process. Weathering breaks down the rock into sediments, erosion removes and moves the sediments, and then deposition is where they end up someplace else. So what forces cause erosion and deposition? The first is mass movements. These are caused by gravity. And the different types of mass movements, many of them are things that we would call a landslide in sort of our everyday speech, but in geology they have slightly different names. Wind is another large force, and here you can see the dunes that were produced by wind deposition. And then water does a lot of erosion and deposition. Groundwater produces caves and caverns. You have waves constantly eroding at the shoreline. You have rivers, both small scale and large scale, that cause great changes to the landscape. And then finally you have ice in the form of glaciers, which act as frozen rivers and also have huge effect on the landscape. In this podcast, we're going to go through mass movements, wind, groundwater, and waves on a very small level of detail, just the basics. And then later you're going to learn about rivers and glaciers in a little bit more detail. The end result is that you should be able to recognize landforms created by these and say how the erosion or deposition or both created those landforms. So let's get started. So a mass movement is the movement of rock or soil downslope due to gravity. So it's really gravity alone making this happen. But it can be triggered by different things. For example, water can saturate the surface materials and make it easier for them to move. So a lot of mass movements happen after heavy rains really saturate the soil, make it really soggy so it can slide downhill a lot more easily. Another trigger could be an oversteepened slope. So if a stream undercuts a valley wall, it makes it weaker at the bottom, that can cause the top to fall. Or if waves cut away the bottom of the cliff, it weakens the bottom, can cause the top to fall. Humans can oversteepen slopes as well. So when engineers are designing construction sites and they're trying to figure out how to landscape areas, they need to make sure not to make the slope so steep that erosion is going to just move everything downhill and bury the houses and stuff at the bottom. Other potential triggers are the removal of vegetation. Plant roots tend to hold the soil together, so if you remove plants, then that's going to increase erosion. And this is true for mass movements as well as water erosion and wind erosion. So plants really keep the soil together. So if you want to combat erosion, leave the plants in the ground. And then finally, they can be triggered by earthquakes, which will shake things up, make them loose, make them more liable to fall. So now let's go through the different types of mass movements. First type is rock falls. So this is exactly what it sounds like. You have rock that's falling, What makes it a rock fall and not a rock slide is that it tends to fall vertically. So if you have a steep cliff straight up and down, and rock from the top falls straight down to the bottom, that's a rock fall. Rock slides are once again just what they sound like. When you have rock that slides down a hill, slides down a slope rather than just falling vertically. And this is a type of landslide. Slump is my favorite. With a slump, the block of sediment stays together and the whole thing just poop slides down. So here you can see the middle block of sediment stuck together as it slid downhill. And there are a lot of examples of slump actually around in our community. Mud flows happen when you have sediment that's largely liquid, so it's mixed with a lot of water. And then it can move very, very quickly and be very destructive. And this picture actually shows mud flows that were caused by the eruption of Mount St. Helens. So when that volcano erupted in the 1980s, the volcanic ash mixed with a lot of water and slid downhill really rapidly. And here you can see an area that was buried by that mud flow. And then later it dried out and you're left with the destruction. Finally, the slowest one is called creep. And I can always remember this because it kind of makes the landscape look really creepy. On the left, you can see the results of creep. You've got these trees where the soil that they're planted in has just kind of slid downhill very slowly, and so you can see how it's affected their growth. On the right, you can see the mechanism for creep. What happens is every winter when the ground freezes, it expands a little bit. And then in the spring when it thaws, those particles shift downhill just a tiny bit as part of the process when it thaws and then contracts again. And so over time, these soil particles just zigzag downhill a tiny bit at a time, and eventually you end up with creep.